the irreducible Jesus. That's my topic for today. Hi, I'm Warren, parish priest here at St. Columba's. Glad you could join me for my message of the day. Sometimes we might be tempted to reduce Jesus down to something less than who he was fully, the complete person. As an example, we might call Jesus a teacher and find his teaching very powerful, which it is. But to reduce him down to a teacher and to make that our focus is also to neglect the other parts of his ministry. For instance, he was a prophet, but also his death and his resurrection. If we reduce Jesus down to some aspect of him or some principle which we then extract from him and then can actually have its own life apart from him, we're not following the fullness, the full Jesus. You think about his life. His life alone didn't change the world. In fact, his life and death wouldn't have changed the world. If you read 1 Corinthians 1, you can see how the death came as a great shock and would have ended any claims to messiahship coming from Jesus. It was his life, death, and resurrection which changed the world, because all three, so to speak, the fullness of Jesus showed the inner meaning of who he was and what he did, and shines a light on any other aspect that we might find meaningful. So it's always a process, a journey to understand the fullness, even as we explore different aspects of who he is. It's tempting sometimes to think of Jesus like a great religious figure who pointed to God. And so you're not meant to look at him, you're meant to look away from him to what he was pointing at. But you see, that's not what we're saying in Christianity, because then we wouldn't be following him, because Jesus is the point, not some part of him, not to what he pointed at. He is the point in his irreducible identity. He can't be reduced to some aspect. He's irreducible, the irreducible identity of Jesus as the Son of God, which immediately implies his relationship to God. That's the whole thing about Jesus and his identity. If we focus on him, immediately that identity, who he is and what he did, is coordinated with God, or in traditional language, the Father. And that implies the Holy Spirit. That's the fullness. And then we are to explore that and tease that out. So for example, if once we do that, and look, this takes time to learn and understand, and to study the scriptures and to understand people who have thought deeply and prayed deeply about this. But in the light of this fullness, we come to see his life, death and resurrection as being the source of our forgiveness, rather than a defeat on the cross, or rather than just being a very brave action on the part of Jesus to die on the cross, to showing his integrity. Because of that fullness, which is focused in on the fullness of who he was, his identity as the Son of God, and therefore his relationship with the Father and the Spirit, that then shines light on the totality of who he is. So that when we do that, we follow Jesus. We're letting who he is, actually the inner meaning of the totality of Jesus, to shine out, and for us to bask in that light. See, when we do the opposite to that, when we cut bits off or we extract a principle out of Jesus, and in a way always run the risk of losing our moorings in the totality of Jesus. When that happens, we end up not following Jesus. We end up following some principle or some other aspect which isn't the fullness. So we won't actually come to understand and be grabbed by the total meaning of who Jesus is. One of the benefits of this approach that I'm talking about here, which is the traditional approach of the church right from the beginning. If you think about Jesus in his appearance, resurrection appearances, he's teaching the disciples about why the scriptures talk about why the Messiah must suffer and die. So he's trying to help them see the fullness, the full meaning of who he is and what he has done. See, when we do this, there's always the source of renewal. Take for an example when we extract a principle out of the ministry of Jesus, and then it can take on its own life. Sometimes we can use a principle which in its own way is very good, but when we try to universalize it, I mentioned this on Sunday, when we try and universalize it, we can do terrible things with the best of intentions. So when we need renewal, if we stay connected to the totality of Jesus, we can go back to that totality to understand how we're misusing this aspect of Jesus, to put that aspect back in the totality, and to stay connected at all times to that totality. So there are times when, it prevents legalism, for instance, because we go back to the Jesus who lived, died, and was raised, and who wasn't a legalist, for instance. You can do this with lots of principles that we try to extract from Jesus. The most prominent one at the moment would be inclusion, which is one of the sort of sacred words of secular society at the moment, which they got from Christianity in the West, got from Christianity. Now, that can be terribly misused. It's absolutely correct to say that was so deeply part of who Jesus is, the inner meaning of Jesus, his life, death, and resurrection, of course. But when it's separated, it can be misused ideologically, often with the best of intentions. So our task is to stay connected to the fullness of Jesus. So part of our task is therefore to try and encounter that fullness. And we can do that, for instance, by reading the scriptures, by learning more about who Jesus was. Prayer, all the things that have been laid down for us, that have been shown to us, these are the ways in which we can come to comprehend the fullness of Jesus, so we can stay connected to him, and we are disciples of that complete Jesus. Thanks for joining me today. Bye-bye.